Coming to you live from the Now Media Newsroom.
I'm Jim Check. You're watching Now Media. With me, Mario Canseco. We have not seen you for a while, ever since all the elections. Glad to have you back.
Great to be back. Yes, it's been, I know for most people who don't like Donald Trump, it seems like it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago, but it was just a few months ago that we were chatting about the results of that election.
There you go. It's, yeah, lots going on, though. Like, lots going on. And this one that you're doing here is really relevant. We had Jonathan Kay on, I think, a few weeks ago. He was in Kelowna, and we got him in the studio here. And one of the things he said that was kind of interesting, he says, like a lot of people complain about the mess in Canada, and then he says, we look out west there, and we say, as bad as Canada is, like, what's going on in BC? He says you literally have the BC NDP kind of living in la-la land, and then the Conservatives just in chaos, just absolute chaos. And he said it's just a fractured party. And one of the things he said, I was actually going to run it as the headline, he said, it's going to take a Stephen Harper or Stephanie Harper to kind of bring the fractures together. And I think that was one of the points that really stuck for me, is like, because it is completely fractured, right? I mean, we saw in the beginning a couple of fractures with, Tara Armstrong, Dallas Brody, and I can't remember the other name that fractured off.
Jordan Keeley.
Yeah, and then the big one with booting out Eleanor Sturko, which I think, might have been the biggest mistake that he's made so far. And then obviously some challenges to his leadership, and a lot of people including the Conservative Party itself, calling for him to step down. And he's sticking around, though.
Well, it hasn't been a good summer. I think the summer is the moment, especially when you have a government that is struggling to connect on its messaging, when you have a labor dispute like the one we had with the BCG EU, with people concerned about inflation and housing still climbing the charts as a matter of concern, particularly for younger British Columbians. Any other center-right option, if we were to go back 20 years, 30 years, social credit, BC Liberals, would be ahead of the NDP. And the reality was the numbers for John Rustad in May, his own personal rating was 37%. By the end of the summer, it was still 37%. So it was a missed opportunity to try to establish that emotional connection with voters. Because I think the main challenge has been connecting with the over 55 voter. This is a voter that sort of came into the NDP's fold during the Horgan years. They were happy with pandemic management, and they sort of stayed there with David Eby, not with the same level of support, particularly for Eby personally. He hasn't reached the same level of ratings that we saw with John Horgan. But it's not as if there's anything that's remotely compelling on the other side that is making the voters age 55 and over think twice about this. If anything, the irony of the numbers for the Conservatives is how well they're connected with young people. You would assume that they're more center-left minded, but the reality is there's a significant group of 18 to 34-year-olds who are very dissatisfied with the housing file. And they want to see some action from whoever can give it to them. And at this point, it seems to be the BC Conservatives. Yeah, they're kind of disenfranchised with what's going on in Canada with, when they look to their future and it doesn't look very bright. I think that's the main message in that. And then John Rustad, the opportunity you talked about, he had this huge opportunity, but I mean, it seems like he can't even hold his party together. And so if people look at that, especially older people look at that and say, well, if you can't even hold your party together, how are you supposed to hold the province together? Well, I think that's, part of the complexity of being the leader of the official opposition is making sure that the caucus is going to be supporting you, trying to figure out a way to establish a narrative that is going to propel you to form the next government. Your job as the leader of the official opposition is to be seen as a premier in waiting. And the reality is this hasn't really happened over the past few months. The party seems to be in disarray, not necessarily when it comes to the caucus or its members, but when you have writing associations saying, please step down, when you have the executive saying, maybe we should consider something different, when you have a difficulty trying to connect with voters in a way that is meaningful, this is why you're having such a hard time trying to get people behind you. And it's also particularly cumbersome for them because, as the survey shows, this isn't an easy thing. It's not as if we have one person there who is going to be 10 or 12 points ahead of the NDP. It's more about the difficulty in trying to get that message across, because the Free Enterprise Coalition, as we knew it, is fractured. You have Center BC organizing, you have One BC organizing. Now, I'm not saying that these two parties are going to be competitive. There's a difference in getting 10,000 people to watch your videos and having 75 candidates ready to run when the election happens. But it certainly speaks about the complexities of trying to form a government that is going to get all of these votes when you have new parties emerging practically every couple of months.
Yeah, I mean, you could forgive him on the first fracture because, you could say, well, that was the right thing to do when, Tara Armstrong and Dallas Brody, and that's right, again, that the other person there, Jody.
Jordan Keeley. Jordan Keeley.
The other one that stepped away from the party, you could say, well, that, they didn't really fit the party mold and that. And then, but Eleanor Sturko was kind of like one of the stronger ones in that party. And then I guess, it looked like a challenge to his leadership or something. And then, he exited her from the party. And then there was the other one that fell right away. I mean, I interviewed her, Eleanor, recently, and also the other young lady that stepped away when he actually came out awkwardly and blamed it on her mental health, which was, even if that was the case, that didn't look well on John Rustad.
Amelia Boltby from Penticton, Summerland. The reality here, and this is something that the data has shown over the past few months, the best file for the BC Conservatives is crime and public safety. They're not climbing the charts on economic management, on housing. But you ask about crime, we see more people who say that the BC Conservatives are on the right track on this issue and not the NDP. That is the file that was managed by Eleanor Sturko. So by essentially asking her to step away from caucus, you lose your best spokesperson. That wasn't a great move on the part of the BC Conservatives. And it's also quite difficult to try to react to something like this when it's so easy for anything to become a political party. One BC is essentially two people who got elected as BC Conservatives suddenly saying we're a caucus and we're going to do these things and we're going to have access to asking questions in the Legislative Assembly, trying to establish things. It's one thing to do this in this early stage, but having candidates who are going to run behind you with the kind of platform that they have, particularly in urban areas, is not going to be easy.
Yeah, and then that new party that started up too, Center One, which I interviewed her as well just recently. It's Karen, isn't it? Well,
Karen Kirkpatrick, yes. Yeah. She ran as an independent in West Vancouver, Capilano, North Vancouver, Capilano, sorry. It's a complicated issue for them as well, because you could look at it and say most people are going to define themselves as centrist. But as we saw with the BC Conservatives, the key to the exercise is actually having an opportunity to be seen as somebody who can win the election or who's going to get more seats than the others. This is what led to the demise of BC United. People suddenly saying the best chance to change the government is going to come with the BC Conservatives. They seem better organized. They could actually get 30, 35, 40 seats. They ended up getting 44, which was great for them. And it's difficult to try to establish this. In a way, it's reminiscent of what we had in Alberta prior to the last provincial election, where people who suddenly became disenchanted with the United Conservative Party were establishing political parties out of their basement. You have 3 or 4 different parties with 3 or 4 different leaders who were well known and who are essentially saying, we are the alternative and we're more conservative than the UCP and we believe in an Alberta that could be part of the United States, or whatever the flavor of the month was. But it kind of looked like that scene from The Life of Brian by Monty Python. It's so you suddenly have so many people who are very similar, but who claim to be different. And the key to the exercise for that election for the UCP, and Danielle Smith should be commended for this, is she didn't play it well. It's like, we need to continue to be the one party, and we're going to make it as difficult as possible for these minor parties to establish themselves. Now, I don't see the same situation happening with John Rustad.
Yeah. I mean, that's what Jonathan Kay's point was. There needs to be, like Stephen Harper did that, right? He brought all those fractures together. and Danielle Smith basically stood a hard line. So where is that person? And you did this poll, and you had 5 people that you basically polled on: Diana Watts, Christy Clark, Gavin Dew, Eleanor Sturko, and Aaron Gunn. All of them kind of in different kind of political situations in there. I'm not sure, Christy Clark would even want it, I guess. I mean, and then it might be a tough sell to British Columbians as well. After, I think she kind of stepped into a couple of cow pies there when she ran as a liberal. So, I mean, it'd be tough for her to say that she's running as a conservative, right? I mean, that would be, changing coats all the time or changing her hats. It'd be a tough slug, but she still polls decently, I guess.
Well, I wasn't surprised to see Diane Watts and Christy Clark at the upper end of the 15 names we tested. There's a lot of goodwill report from the voters when it comes to these 2 individuals. Diane Watts has more conservative credentials. I mean, she served in the House of Commons as a member of Parliament. But it's really about the name recognition in a way. And I think when you have people of this stature who are doing essentially a statistical tie with the NDP, it shows how difficult it's going to be to get those over 55 voters. Now, Sturko did very well, but she's no longer in caucus. I mean, there might be a scenario where she comes back after John Rustad and maybe she can lead the party. Aaron Gunn did very well, won his election in North Island, Powell River. He's really establishing himself as a young figure of conservatism across the country. So it's not a surprise to see people relating to him in a much more positive fashion than, for instance, what we see with Ellis Ross or with James Moore in the same survey. So out of the 5, the only person who's in caucus right now is Gavin Dew. And I think he's done a very good job trying to raise the level of debate, talking about specifics when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to the economy and jobs. Part of the problem with the Conservatives, they seem to be too focused on memes and trying to make people be really riled up on Twitter. This isn't going to help those who are struggling with their finances or who are hoping to get into the housing market do things differently. I think this is what really sets Gavin Dew apart. He's really talking about specifics. And I think he would be a person, contrary to what is happening to John Rustad now, who would be seen very, very positively by the business community in Metro Vancouver. They've had a hard time dealing with John Rustad because when he was in government in minor roles, we have to say, he wasn't somebody who was particularly respected by the business community.
Yeah, Gavin Dew is very articulate. I've interviewed him, I think, the most. I mean, many, many times. And he's very articulate. He kind of fits that mold, kind of that center right. And he's very much business oriented, but he also has that social conscience. And I think, he definitely, and he's a straight talker too. And he talks simple, right? Whereas, not in circles. I mean, we see some word salads coming out of the federal politics right now where you can listen to 5 minutes and you're just like, I don't think I heard an answer in that. But Gavin Dew is pretty straight. Eleanor Sturko also fairly straight when she talks to, it's very simple language, which I think is one of the gifts that both of them have there. I'm not sure if Aaron Gunn would take that as a step backwards for himself. Maybe he's looking, you know what I mean? It'd be tough to convince him, I think. Christy Clark, I think, would be a tough sell to most British Columbians. Diana Watts, I'm not that familiar with, but it seems like she has, some stuff going for her too. Lots of times people that have been on in media and that have definitely some appeal to people as well, right?
Well, she ran for the leadership, lost against Andrew Wilkinson. People within NDP circles were essentially terrified that she would be the leader. They thought it was going to be a significant challenge. Even when the next election happened, it didn't materialize. Of course, everything changed because of the pandemic. Andrew Wilkinson wasn't able to really coalesce anything behind him. And we had a 2020 election where the NDP won seats that they didn't even expect, particularly in the Fraser Valley. All of those seats, or most of those seats, have now gone back to the Free Enterprise Coalition in the form of the BC Conservatives. But it's, Diane still carries that weight. I think there's especially a very positive perception of the way she did things in Metro Vancouver. And this is ultimately what the BC Conservatives need. You can't get more seats by running the numbers in places where we already won. It doesn't make sense to win seats in northern British Columbia with 80% of the vote, unless you can break through in specific areas of Metro Vancouver where they haven't been able to do so. Or in the island. I think the federal election provides a very interesting cautionary tale for all political parties. You look at the federal map in the island and it's a rainbow. You got a little bit of green, you got a little bit of blue, you got a little bit of orange, and you get a little bit of red. So it's ultimately about the way in which you connect with those communities. And it's not an area that is solidly behind the NDP like it used to in the past.
You got to find the right candidates in the right mix, I guess. But one of the things for the Conservatives, they need to be ready, though, because this NDP government seems to have a lot of pots on the stove that are boiling over. You know, if you look at their healthcare file, it seems to be like a huge mess, especially when you talk about the interior of British Columbia here, when we're seeing, you know, like mass resignations of pediatricians, psychiatrists, OBGYNs, and then ER closure after ER closure. The crime and safety file is kind of out of hand. And, you know, David Eby even admitted that his experiment there with decriminalization didn't work yet. He still runs it into January. Housing is still bad. And then the uncertainty that's come about with, and I think this is the big one for him, is the Cowichan land decision, I think, and the stuff that's been happening behind closed doors. I did an interview with Jeff Moise, you probably know him too, Aboriginal lawyer. That was a really good interview, and he said that they're continuing doing these closed door meetings behind the closed doors there, that are not allowing British Columbians to see what's going on. And I think that's an Achilles heel for him. And that doesn't even mention what happened with the BC ferries, because, you know, like some of these other pots are boiling over so bad that the BC ferries thing has become, you know, like just like, you know, like way down on the list of fires. But you know, like Jonathan Kay said, like, I just think that the Conservatives aren't ready, though.
Well, there's a way to try to establish an emotional connection with voters on all of these issues. You know, if you're over 55 voters looking at the NDP as the option they would support, really focus on the healthcare file. You're over 55 voter, which is, as we know, the one that participates the most in elections, is not going to be on Twitter, is not going to be impressed by whatever meme you created with David Eby's face. That might help your 18 to 34 voter who is already a conservative. So the best way to do this would be to try to discuss the issues that matter to the over 55s. It's consistently healthcare, because most of them are not really preoccupied with the housing market. Many of them are retired, so they're not going to be that worried about fluctuations on inflation. Connect on the healthcare file. That is the essence of the argument for the Conservatives. And it just really hasn't been that easy, because I think they're getting bogged down in a bunch of situations more related to the culture wars. And it's not something that is going to move voters. You know, we asked 1,003 British Columbians what the top issue facing the province was at the start of October. Not one of them wrote ostriches.
No, yeah. I mean, that's a kind of a, you know, a special interest group that's in there, right? I mean, there's so many kitchen table issues that I think that are really bothering people, right? I mean, it's you know, like I've done some interviews with bankruptcy trustees, you know, talking about 67% of, you know, Canadians $200 away from, you know, like not meeting their monthly obligations. So those are the issues that are worrying people, right? Like, you know, like mortgages are coming for renewal, and you know, like it's probably going to put them over, so they're going to start, you know, like overdrafting their credit cards. All those things I think are the most important things. But I look at this, and you know, there's some other names you had in there too that are, there's no real standout though, is there? Harman Bangu, I also interviewed in the past, very well spoken as well, right? Very well spoken, speaks clearly. But you know, Peter Milabar, interviewed him as well, again, very well spoken. Is there somebody in there that you would say that's the clear leader though?
Well, out of, I mean, taking away, of course, Diane Watson, Christy Clark, who are, you know, retired. Yeah. I was a little bit surprised at how well Brad West did, particularly in the Fraser Valley. He's somebody who's very well respected in Metro Vancouver, even though he's the mayor of a fairly small municipality. But there's a way in which he has been able to connect with voters beyond, and certainly at a larger rate than most mayors in a similar position. the other issue that is interesting looking at the number, I mean, Harman Bangu doesn't do that well. He's on the bottom 5 when you look at the top 15 names that we tested. There's a story to be told, because you look at the numbers with the South Asian community and it just flies. It's just amazing. I think there's a lot of people there who are hoping to have somebody who looks like them represent them, and you know, this could lead to wins in places such as Surrey and Delta, where the Conservatives didn't do as well as they expected in the last election. But that's it. I mean, there's another group that is not really looking forward to somebody like Harman becoming premier, and it's part of the complexity of having a story to tell. This is ultimately what a leadership race does, you know, because ultimately you think about how we felt, or how the conventional wisdom indicated that the last federal leadership race for the Conservatives would go. Jan Charest is an expert. He's going to do remarkably well. Pierre Poilievre's a rookie. He sure did way better than most people expected, and is still the leader of the party, and Jan Charest is not.
Yeah, but it takes a strong person, though, too, to actually lead and bring people together, right? Because you're going to have some people with hurt feelings when they think, because obviously right now we look at this and there's hairs, right, between a lot of these people, and some people are going to feel like, you know, that, you know, they should have been the leader and that. So where do you find that Daniel Smith or Stephen Harper or even Pierre Poilievre? Like, where do you find that somebody that is really strong on message, but also is able to bring people together? And we're actually seeing some fractures with Pierre right now too, right? So
yeah. Well, I think that is the big challenge, and you know, part of me thinks this is a time that for the center right in British Columbia is very similar to the latter years of the 1990s. You know, you came very close to winning an election under Gordon Campbell. In that occasion, they actually had more votes but fewer seats. You felt that the NDP government was on its way out anyway. And Gordon Campbell used those couple of years to really assemble a team together, to do something different, to figure out what type of caucus and what type of candidates he wanted. And he ended up winning the largest majority in the history of the province. So this is what's required. And the way you don't do this is by saying to people, we're going to establish purity tests. So if you say something like this about reconciliation, you're out. If I feel that you're going to take away from my leadership, you're out. If you're not happy with the way in which I'm running things, you're out. This isn't the way in which you can build a party that is going to be seen by most British Columbians as a party they would support. And I think that's been the major complexity for John Rustad. Yes, you came very close, but if you look at his numbers, there was a missed opportunity in the debate. You know, he's climbing, and his numbers haven't recovered from the televised debate. I think there was an opportunity to say to most British Columbians, here I am, and this is who you can have as your head of government. And he hasn't been able to get that traction. And I think this is why we're having so many questions about this. You know, if we had writing associations complaining about David Eby, people saying that David Eby should go, we would gladly add 15 names to a survey on the NDP leadership, but the place where this is happening is the BC Conservatives.
Yeah. I would have a hockey analogy. I would say that John Rustad is the Michael Keenan of politics, right? The hard line. This is my way or the highway. But Mike Keenan kind of wore out his welcome after 2 years, almost everywhere, right? Because it was. And then if you take a look at Scotty Bowman, which was more of a, you know, like a mentor kind of thing, and he won championships, right? So. And that's what I would look at. I think that, you know, like that hard line stance I don't think it works anymore more for people, right? You know what I mean? Like my way or the highway. And we're seeing it. It's causing fractures, right?
Well, and, you know, I think going back to the example of Gordon Campbell in the 90s, it's a different time. The internet is fairly new. There's no social media. You're not going to have as much attention on the things that somebody tweets or says. It's part of the type of message that has to be there and that has to be coherent for the party to function. And it's been very difficult for them to try to develop that. You know, some days they are very heavy on the criticism. Some days they are very light on the policy side of things. And there's been a difficulty for John Rustad to try to counter the message, to try to effectively establish an official opposition that is working. And in a way, because of what is happening with Centre BC and One BC, To me, it's reminiscent of the latter days of the Brian Mulroney government. Mind you, Rustad is not in government, but anything that he says is more centrist-oriented. Karine Kirkpatrick can raise her hand and say, "Oh, I'm going to do more than that," because we're not radicals. We think he's just too radical. And anything that he's trying to do to cater to the center-right, there's Dallas Brody, who is completely on the far right end of the spectrum. So you wind up in a situation where people who don't find you appealing have an opportunity to move a little bit more to the left or a little bit more to the right to see something they like.
All of his flanks are exposed, and I'm sure there's some people still within the party that are probably, waiting for the other shoe to drop too. Like, does he survive this, I guess is the question. Does he survive this, or is he kind of riding out like the last days of Kevin Falcon, just in denial right now?
Well, I think if there's one thing that can actually be very effective in making the decision easier for him if he's going to step down, it'll be the fundraising numbers from the last quarter. They weren't particularly great for the previous one. It's as if people are trying to wait and see what is going to happen. Do I donate to this political party now with all this turmoil, with all these problems, or do we wait it out, see if there's a leadership race and see if there's somebody there I can get behind? Because this is essentially what happened and what led them to the situation where they became the de facto opposition party. The fact that people were looking at BC United and saying, Kevin Falcon's heart is not in this. No. We're just going to go with the Conservatives. Is there something similar that is going to happen a year and a half away from that particular moment where people are saying, I'm not happy with David Eby, I'm not happy with the NDP running the show, but I just don't see a situation where John Rustad is the person that I want to support.
I know you and I talked about this way back when Kevin Falcon handed the ball to John Rustad at the 1 yard line, and then he threw the ball on the ground and says, I don't need that. And I think that was probably the biggest missed opportunity he had by not contacting all those candidates at that time and then trying to build a big tent. And then a lot of those people ran against him. You'd probably be sitting in government right now. I think he let his ego get in his way, and I think he might be letting his ego get in his way right now.
Well, and it's a complicated issue. I mean, I can understand that there was a leadership review, that there was a process, that there were votes, that he gets a significant percentage of the voters who took part in that particular process. But there's questions. There's questions about the people who were signed up. There's questions about the quality of the list. We haven't heard this in other political processes. The Greens just went through their process and nobody's crying foul. So that's also part of what makes this so complicated. You could point to a percentage of votes, but if the process is being questioned by your own supporters, that's an issue.
And then the fallout from Amelia Boltby there with checking phones and then just that awkward kind of saying that she had mental health issues and that's why she left the party. It just didn't look good, right? Just on an optics thing, even if he was right, you know what I mean? Like it just looked pretty bad.
Well, and it's not something that you want to hear in this day and age. We see the importance that young people place on mental health. We know how much people are struggling with complexities in their daily lives, and for your de facto reason for not being unhappy with a person who decides to leave the caucus says, oh, well, we just don't think she's mentally stable. This isn't going to endear you to voters who don't look at you seriously, and it's going to make particularly women who supported you in the past think twice about doing it again.
Do you think there's any way that John Rustad can kind of bring people back together and kind of, retain the leadership and win government? Do you think there's a path for him?
Well, I think it depends on a couple of issues. The first one is going to be fundraising. Can you actually look at people and say, I am the one who is going to deliver you from having an NDP government, even when the next election happens? If the fundraising numbers are there, there's a possibility, of course. But it's also, how do you try to sustain a caucus that is going to be there consistently behind you? It's not usual to lose 5 of your 44 members in the first year that you're in government, or that in the first year after the election takes place. So it's not as if it's a group that is going to be working very well, and I think it's also about how can he make himself more compelling to Metro Vancouverites. There were places that traditionally voted for the BC Liberals and stayed with the BC Conservatives, particularly in places like Surrey. But there were seats in Vancouver that the BC Liberals held under their worst performing leader in history, which was Andrew Wilkinson. Langara, for instance, the other one was Yaletown, which were lost to the NDP. And it's a combination of badly run campaigns, a terrible candidate selection, but it's also because people just don't see Rustad as the person who should take over as the next head of government. So how do you make yourself more compelling as a head of government in the Metro Vancouver area? And that really starts with having a good relationship with the business community. It's quite interesting to look at the business community, say, we're not happy with any of this, but they had an opportunity to go to the opposition and say, what are you going to do for us? And they just don't seem that happy with the things that John Rustad is saying or doing.
There is an opportunity, I think this will be my last question. There is an opportunity, I think, right now, though, because I think a lot of people are really nervous about the land decision there on the private lands that were, and a lot of these negotiations happening behind closed doors. Yes. And I even think some of the NDP might be a little nervous as to what's going on there, because from what I understand, that a lot of this is just being driven right out of the Premier's office as opposed to through the caucus. And there may be some nervousness there, because I think people are starting and they don't want to wake the people up, but if the people wake up, there may be a bigger push. And if you could get the right leader on the center there, you maybe even get some NDP candidates to walk across the floor there, just because I think a lot of people view this right now as BC's at risk, especially from capital investment, uncertainty. I mean, we're starting to see, BC, the economy definitely sliding here. A whole bunch of things are thinking, and if you don't have, I mean, the whole thing is based on private property rights, right? I mean, it's a tough thing, right? And we're talking about investment capital too. If you're investing in billions of dollars into a project, you don't know whether you should be dealing with the First Nations group or with the BC government or who you're dealing with. I mean, it just lends to uncertainty.
It's going to be very, very difficult to maneuver. We know that this is something that has been decades in the making. But that cannot be an excuse for the government to say, well, this started back when we weren't in government and we're not responsible for it. Especially if we continue to see people expressing concern about the status of their own properties. And this ultimately, in my estimation, is squarely on the credibility of the Cowichan tribes. They say, we're not coming after your home. We need to figure out if most British Columbians believe that or not, and how the government might act on whatever happens from the court case. But right now, there's a significant proportion of residents who are at a high level of unease because of this decision. And the efforts, both in the part of the Richmond municipal government and the BC government, haven't really quelled those feelings. So it's going to be tough, partly because it's not in your hands. It's not a situation where...
Well, they're not even involved in it. They weren't even informed, right? And then Jeff Moyse, the lawyer there, says it's, like the BC NDP and the Liberals adopted UNDRIP and DRIPA, and that's what needs to be taken out, because that's not a Canadian constitutional law. And that was what they did. And like Eleanor Sturco making those points as well. So... I mean, and they won't stop negotiating behind closed doors, and I think that's what's worrying a lot of British Columbians.
Well, because we know it's not the kind of thing that ends with somebody just signing something, right? The court process takes years, if not decades. The appeals process is going to go like that. So how can you offer some sort of stability on something that is out of your control? And it can't just be, we're holding town halls and we're listening to your concerns. We're way past that stage. This is something that should have happened a couple of years ago, when you knew this was something that could potentially happen, and now it's too late, and it'll have an effect on everything else that happens. To me, that is the biggest danger for the government at this point. If this is something that makes people really upset with the government, even if it's not completely justified to pin this on them directly, there's not going to be any going back from this. If you knock on doors and people tell you David Eby is the one who's responsible for me not owning my house, there's no coming back from that.
Yeah, I advise people to go listen to that interview with Jeff Moyes. He dropped a couple of big bombs in that interview, and he was working for the government through six governments. He was working in Aboriginal law and settled some of the treaties, and he's got lots of experience in that area. And he's just trying to educate, so I'd go listen to that. And he said some things there that I was even shocked with. So, kind of like uncertain times for British Columbians for sure. And again, like I'll just bring it back to Jonathan Kay. Like as bad as Canada seems sometimes, you look over at BC and say, well, we're doing quite well compared to what's going on over there. Right? So.
Well, it's because of the way in which the coalitions are emerging. You know, you look at Ontario. Doug Ford wouldn't have these massive majorities if you didn't have Liberal voters and NDP voters saying, I don't like what I have in front of me. Yeah. And it's a similar scenario here. You know, you have longtime BC Liberal voters who went, no, even if Kevin Falcon is asking me to vote for John Rustad's people, no. I'm not there yet, and this is part of what makes this such a compelling issue, because it's no longer a center-right versus center-left issue. Is can you actually look at the person who's leading the official opposition as a premier in waiting? And the answer at this particular moment is no.
Yeah, there seems to be a lot of drop balls and a lot of different things. We don't even talk about BC ferries. We talk about all that stuff that seems to be going on, right? Like it seems like I said, lots of pots boiling over. But I do thank you for your time. It's always great, always very enlightening for sure. And anytime you do another one of these polls, that'd be great to see, because there is, like David Eby's leadership will probably get looked at as well, right? So, and then Ravi Parmer's name is thrown around quite a bit on that one as well. But
yeah, I mean, we'll see what happens this weekend when they have their own leadership review. I mean, there's no magic number for these things. But there's also a difficulty, especially because the NDP is going to lead to deal with the BC Greens coming at them from the left. Emily Lowan's discussions about the BCGEU, walking on the picket lines, they're coming after some of those voters. And it's the same problem that John Rustad is facing. If 5, 7, 8% of people start to look at the Greens as an option they can support, and their union people, it's going to get interesting.
One thing you can say about David Eby and the NDP, they seem to have held their party together. You know what I mean? They seem to keep their dirty laundry, in a basket.
in a nice hamper that nobody sees.
That's right. They seem to keep it in where John Rustad just throws it all around the room, I guess. But there you go.
That's a good metaphor.
All right. Thank you, Mario. Again, very enlightening, and we really appreciate when we get you on. And we do thank you for watching Now Media.
Thanks, Jim.
We don't just report the news. We live here, too. We're your neighbors, bringing you stories that matter to all of us. No government funding, no outside influence. Kelowna Now, local, independent. News you can trust.